And we're back with a final, hopefully, recording of this review. And we're on cultural context, where we're picking up on adaptation. And we're talking about cultural context in film adaptation. We're talking about social, historical, and cultural environments that influence a film's creation, its interpretation, and its reception by the audience, obviously. So it really involves adapting a story to resonate with a new audience, not the original one that it was written for, by modifying elements like setting, character traits, and themes to align with local customs and values rather than relying solely on direct translation. And so we saw a little bit of that in when we were looking at the video with Dr. Jubin, Professor Jubin, when she was talking about adaptations and how different more contemporary versions view certain plays. Like in Hamlet, there was a movie where Hamlet was played by a woman who was masking herself as a man and all this other kind of stuff. There's been so many different adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, and so the this type of adaptation, when it comes to cultural context, it really helps us, the audience, understand not the author, but the films and the filmmaker's deeper meaning of where they're going with it. And it can range from minor adjustments, minor tweaks, to really significant ideological changes. Like I said, having Hamlet be portrayed by a woman who masquerades as a man. So it really just depends on the filmmaker's intent and their target culture. What are they trying to? What message are they trying to get across? So, from the critical history of film adaptation, they quote: "A film may be inspired by a novel, but it utilizes a different vehicle through which to tell its story. Films are visual." Oral, and they are consumed passively in a collective environment, usually in a theater with an audience, but also in the home, often in the presence of friends and family. And so when we're looking at cultural context and film adaptation, we need to understand that films reflect the values, beliefs, and societal norms that they're created in, because those things are influenced by historical events, cultural trends, and even some social issues. So it makes sense, right? Cultural context plays an important role in adaptation because it really helps us as the audience identify with the filmmaker's intentions, their messages, the significance of their aesthetic choices. For instance, Roman Polanski's decision to use black and white cinematography versus color in his version of Macbeth, when we saw Act One, Scene One. It also helps us understand the filmmaker's narrative elements, how they portray gender roles during a particular time. Again, having Hamlet be played by a female masquerading as a man. And so, what message are we to get from that? So, in our first module, and I covered this way back when, but in our first module, we learned about denotation and connotation. And we know that, there's a lot of understanding when it comes to denotation and connotation. In adaptation, especially in cultural context, we have to dig deeper into what the filmmaker intends, their connotation, not the denotation. And so, why do we do that? Because words and images, separately and together, carry a greater implication of meaning than simple denotative meaning, which denotation is the definition of whatever that word is. And so, how far then do meaning implications carry over from one culture to another? And how far does it matter if viewers in another culture identify alternative culture specific implications? And this is a quote by Lee and other authors together. They also go on to say that key aspects of the narrative, whether it's human motivations, family relations, moral dilemmas, and even processes of causality, are subject to a variety of interpretations. So when it comes to cultural context and film adaptation, it really basically brings whatever that canonical text is into a contemporary setting so that it makes sense to us. Okay, so that's the power and the understanding of um, cultural context. So let's look at what it means to analyze films. And there's different ways to analyze films. And so we have semiotic analysis. We also have narrative analysis. We have cultural historical analysis and mise en scene analysis. So let's cover these real quick so that we can understand more about this. So there are different approaches, and these are the different approaches to film analysis that's important for us to better understand. Okay, so semiotic is where we interpret signs and symbols, typically involving like metaphors, um, and analogies to both inanimate objects and characters within a film. And so symbols have different meanings. It may have several meanings, as we saw when we were understanding Macbeth. And so writers often need to determine what a particular symbol means in the film or in a broader cultural or historical context. So this points back to what we just learned about with pragmatism, okay, in the previous lesson. When exploring semiotic film analysis, here's some questions that you can ask, especially if you're annotating. It's always good to be able to have questions that you can ask yourself while you're annotating. One is, what objects or images are repeated throughout the film? If there was a film of Catcher in the Rye, there isn't one, but if there was one, something we know that would be repeated would be that red hat and the glove and the baseball glove with the green writing. Okay. How does the director associate a character with small signs such as certain colors, clothing, food, or language use? Okay. How does a symbol or object relate to other symbols and objects? Meaning, what's the relationship between the film signs, right? So, the dagger and blood, the relationship between those and other things within Macbeth. Okay. Narrative analysis is where we examine the story's elements, and so we're looking at the narrative structure, character, and plot. Okay, this type of analysis considers the entirety of the film and the story is trying to tell. And so when we explore the narrative analysis, we're asking questions like, how does the film correspond to the three-act structure? Or in the case of Macbeth, his five-act structure, or Shakespeare, because Shakespeare often wrote beyond three acts. And what is the structure? Act one is the setup, act two is the confrontation, act three is the resolution, right? Obviously, if it's five, that's going to be spread out. But overall, how does that relate to that structure? And so we're really deconstructing the film from that perspective. And so, what is the plot of the film? We want to know what is the main point of the film? How does that plot differ from the narrative? Meaning, how does the plot differ from how the story is being told? Are the events in the film and the story being told out of order, and to what effect? Remember that at any given point, for instance, in a novel, we may get the exposition, the backstory, in the form of a what do we call that? Oh my goodness, a flashback. So we may enter the story at the climax, like really get in. We may be at the conflict or the climax and get the backstory during like some type of flashback scene. Is that possible? So this is what we mean by when we're looking at narrative and analysis. Does the plot revolve around one character or multiple characters? Um, how are these characters developed across the film? So we're looking at those types of things. And looking at the cultural or historical analysis of a film, this is the most common film analysis. And we basically are putting the film into a particular context. So we're asking questions about how the film um, is modeled, or how does the film, excuse me, in better terms, how the film models, challenges, or even subverts different types of relations, meaning, how does it challenge historical, social, or even theoretical lenses? So, in this analysis, it really requires us to think about the historical period in which the film was made or is made. That includes any major events, political climates, social movements, and those influences on the film's themes, their narration, or production. And so, like with Macbeth, and we look at the Apple TV version, we can see that, it's brought into a modern lens, but it's still, as far as and how it's the how the again how the weird sisters and how they are portrayed in different things, right? So it's still telling the story, and it's actually, really respectful of the canonical text, but it's still told from a different lens. And so, um, in cultural historical analysis, we also explore the landscape surrounding the film's dominant cultural values. So, if Macbeth was written for an Eastern demographic or Asian demographic, it would not look like any of the ones that most likely that we looked at, any of the film adaptations or theatrical adaptations that we looked at, because none of those incorporated the cultural values, beliefs, or societal practices of Eastern or Oriental cultures. And so, when we are looking at cultural and historical analysis, we are looking at how those things, how that film represents the different cultural groups and identities um, of a particular audience. Okay, so when we're looking at this, we'll ask questions like, how does the film comment on, reinforce, or even critique social and political issues at the time it was released? And so that this includes questions of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Okay, how might a biographical understanding of the film's creator and their historical moment affect the way you view the film? And how might a specific film theory, such as queer theory, structuralist theory, or Marxist film theory, provide a language or set of terms for articulating the attributes of the film? And understanding those different things, those theories, you don't need to really know about it, but those are things that you look at if you were using this particular one. But there's so many other questions that you can ask to analyze the film without getting into those theories. And an important note to make about cultural historical analysis is to consider the reception or impact the film has. Like, what's the public's response to it upon its release? Remember that when we first was doing this lesson, I talked about Black Panther and how worldwide it was a phenomenon, and different things, and how people received it. The whole thing, whole concept of the Avengers and all of that in relation to that one film. Even, and when I say worldwide, that movie grossed $1 billion. It was huge. It was a huge blockbuster film. And the same thing now with Sinners, and it has gotten 16 Academy Award nominations. And so, in looking at how films are received worldwide, even in their adaptations for certain cultural contexts, and so, is it controversial? Does the public see it as controversial? And what are the long-term influences of the film, specifically as it relates to pop culture? And that's why I said with Black Panther, and social discourse, because in a lot of the Marvel stories, Stan Lee really dealt with social issues, but in a very creative way with these characters. You even if you're not into that, you can get into, even if you're not into the Avengers and that part of Marvel, you can get into the X-Men, and look at Xavier, Professor X, and Magneto. Everybody believed that, and even Stan Lee, I believe, mentioning that it was Malcolm X versus um, Dr. Martin Luther King and their approaches to dealing with injustice. Okay. And so, how is that received in that messaging tone? And so finally, we have mise-en-scene analysis. This type of analysis organizes the individual elements of a scene to explore how they come together to produce meaning. This sounds like, hello, close reading. Because what do? We deconstruct to better understand. So we're taking, instead of the bigger overall picture, we're taking pieces of the film and we're deconstructing it to better understand the overall. That sounds like close reading. And so that's what mise-en-scene analysis is. And so we're looking at all of the different parts. And so here's some questions to think about when it comes to mise-en-scene analysis. What effects are created in a scene and what is their purpose? How does this scene represent the theme of the movie? And how does a scene work to express a broader point to the front film's plot? And so remember that I read a clip from a piece of writing, close reading on A Wrinkle in Time. And you could take a portion of that film and take that part where she was talking about Mrs. Who and Mrs. Which and how they disappeared and the glasses and all of those different things, and take that one seed and deconstruct it and look at the overall context of it in relation to the film overall. All right. So let's get into, as we wind down, into contemporary novels. Okay, this was our pretty much our culminating final lesson where we were learning about contemporary novels. And when it comes to contemporary novels, we have to understand that those are stories set in the present day, or the recent past, and they reflect on current societal, cultural, and political realities. They focus on relatable, believable characters that deal with modern issues like technology, identity, mental health, relationships, and often they explore themes of new meaning in the here and now. What's going on today? What can I connect with and make sense to today? And so, this quote is from Brown University. Is from Brown University. There were several English department leaders that came together at Duke University for a symposium about contemporary novels, and this is what basically kind of an overview of that. And they said the novels we want to consider contemporary exploit the world-making power of their respective national traditions to make sense of this event, not only by critiquing the categories of self, household, property, and nation that organize traditional fiction and the world it asks us to assume is out there. These novels also try out alternative ways of inhabiting the world, and engaging both the societal forces that blow it apart and the effective glue that holds it together. So that's contemporary novels. Let's quickly go into the 8 types of annotation for contemporary modern novels. Now, we just went through this more extensively recently because this is the most recent lesson, but let's go over it. For first of all, we're going to talk about the plot. You want to know any dramatic conflicts, any reversals, resolutions of the plot. What's going on with the plot? Are there major shifts in the episode? Are we looking at flashback scenes? When does the plot take any ironic twists? So, as the plot moves from place to place, we want to consider summarizing events in the margin as you annotate. Hello. So you can re enter the story more quickly. So, if you have to walk away, you would know where to pick the story back up. You want to annotate key dialogue that reveals characters, actions, and choices that indicate what motivates the characters, any reactions to events that help you understand the character. Okay. What are some character traits that you see, and list those character traits? Um, when does the narrative show us these traits, and when does he tell us about them? Are there ironic traits in the character that make sense, but we didn't expect, right? Who is the protagonist, the main character? Who is the antagonist, the villain? What is the nature of their conflict? Right? Are any of the minor characters more significant than they seem at first? It might to help, like you may want to keep like a table of characters in the text, right? Just like in a play where you have the dramatis personae, a whole table of contents of characters. You can do the same thing for a contemporary novel or any type of novel or anything that you're reading. You want to circle and define words or references that are unfamiliar to you. We're talking about diction here. We went through this, especially with Macbeth, because there were so many terms that we didn't understand. For instance, hurly burly. We had to look up. So we're going to do the same thing here with Sylvia Plath's initiation. We didn't have to do that because she defined the words for us as she wanted us to understand them. But what does the diction, the word choice, tell us about the intended audience or even the narrator? What's what illusions is the author making? Are there terms that you know the author especially wants us to think about? You want to know the main physical philosophical ideas, or what is the main thought? What's the issue? What concepts are the author playing around with? Identifying specific symbols. What symbolism is there? Why are they using this symbolism? Okay, what is the story trying to tell us? Okay. Are there any particularly stunning turns of phrases, beautiful passages of dialogue, memorable lines, like things that are just beautifully written that catches your eye, right? Um, do either the narrator or any of the characters have a spell of writing charm or melody? It's just beautiful. We can also look at the most impressive visual scenes in A Wrinkle in Time. There are lots of them as they're describing how the tesseract and how they travel throughout the universe. Where are they located? At multiple locations. What's the role of nature in the fiction, in the novel? Interior versus exterior elements. Okay. What types of imagery dominate the story and why? Are there like emblems or significant details that the author are sharing, especially when they go into very specific details about items and they hone in on it? That's important to note. And then finally, note any main passages that help us understand the narrator, whether it's narrative intrusions, explicit narrative judgments. Is this narrator very judgmental? Moments of uncertainty that the narrator has. Do they have mood swings? Are they being sarcastic? What is the mood of this particular narrator? So these are 8 types um, of annotation things that we can do for contemporary novels. So let's get into more annotation tips for contemporary novels. So these should all be fresh in your mind again, since we just finished this as our latest lesson. When it comes to style are the writing tools that authors use. And so this includes figurative language, imagery, diction, syntax, poetic devices, how they use words. Predictions are exactly what it sounds like. What do you think will happen next? Okay. And so when we get into recurring motifs, images, and themes, I just talked about that. Connection to other works, that's allusions. In A Wrinkle in Time, there's a point when Meg made a reference to the Cheshire Cat. That's an allusion. The Cheshire Cat is a character in Alice in Wonderland. And obviously, contemporary commentary. What is your opinion? Okay. When it gets into close reading of contemporary novels, these are some techniques that you can use, everything from diddles to rhetorical devices. So let's do a quick rundown of these. Again, we just went over this in our recent lesson. So we have diction is the connotation of the word choice. Images, vivid appeals to understanding through the senses. Details, facts that are included or those that are omitted. Language, the overall use of language, whether it's formal, clinical, or jargon. And then sentence structure. How does the structure affect your attitude as the reader? Does it make any sense? Then with SIFT, we're looking at symbols. Examine and identify the title and text for symbolism. Again, images, figures of speech. You're analyzing basically how the author is using words. And then when it comes to tone or theme, we're discussing how all devices reveal tone and theme, like how everything from the narrator on down. How does this make us feel, and how does the author feel about what they're talking about? Soapstone, remember that this is more for a nonfiction um, close read than fiction. But these are the things that you can look at when it comes to soapstone. And so we're looking at the speaker. Who is speaking? Who's the narrator? Who's speaking? And what assumptions can we make about them? When it comes to the occasion, what may have prompted the author to write this piece? Um, does the speaker, the narrator, use language that is specific for a unique audience? What way does the author convey the message? Right? What's the emotional state of the speaker? Why did they write this piece? When it comes to the subject, what is the topic that the author, the speaker is focusing on, and how do we know this? And then obviously tone is the author's attitude toward the subject. Now, when we get into twist, it's nothing different than what we previously talked about when it comes to tone, word choice, imagery, detail, style, and theme. All of these things are pretty much the same. We're not it's nothing new. As they say, there's nothing new under the sun. We just went over this tone, the attitude. When it comes to these different techniques, it's all about finding the one that works for you and making it work. Remember, when it comes to annotating, it really is about what works for you and finding your style and your niche. So remember, we annotate while we're reading, we annotate after we read. And so finding these different techniques for close reading, because close reading is a form of annotation, we're just taking a bigger taking a smaller text from the bigger one, and we're bringing it in so that we can better understand. We're deconstructing to better understand. But all of these different techniques that I just reviewed for you are approaches or methods to um, being able to close read, and whether it's a contemporary novel or something else. So we talk about rhetorical devices. You may say, well, Teacher Latanya, you didn't talk about that. Absolutely, I did. I've been talking about rhetorical devices all day. It's all in the figurative language, as well as in the literary devices of what authors choose to use and how they play around with words and allusions, making connections to other works and stuff. So when we talk about close reading contemporary novels, whether it's Diddles, Sift, Soapstone, which is more for nonfiction, but you can use approaches here, or Twist, it's all to help you better understand how to take something big when you're looking at a smaller piece of work, to better understand overall what the author is talking about. And so, again, in my example of A Wrinkle in Time, I took something from chapter 5 of the whole book and just closely read just a small passage, and looking at some of the illusion that was there. Again, Meg, the main character, she's the protagonist, alluding to the Cheshire Cat, which is a character in Alice in Wonderland. Okay, that's an illusion, but also some of the things of how the rhetorical devices, the literary devices, and figurative speech that the author chose to write about and use in talking about Mrs. Witch, Mrs. Who's It, and those characters, and how they talked about the way they traveled. That whole chapter is entitled The Tesseract, and it talks about how they travel through space, and getting to wherever they need to go, and how they seem to disappear, and all of these different things. And what was left over were the glasses, and then the glasses went next. And how Meg marveled at it, and the weird feeling that her stomach got in the travel. And during the travel, before they left, she was holding on to her brother's hand, but she was talking about as she was traveling, she could no longer feel his hand. And so she wasn't sure if he was still with her or not. But that's the writing. That's what we could see. You could visualize that. But you can also identify with it. Even in the beginning of the book, when it was talking about Meg's character and her personality and the way she was acting out in school because of her dad's absence and everything that was going on, it was a huge hit to her. And so, in looking at that, I could close read that, but also identify with that absence and how she felt, even if it wasn't direct